Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today, after much delay, I'm finally able to bring you part one of our B550 VRM thermal testing. In this video, we'll be checking out just over half a dozen entry-level micro ATX B550 boards priced between $95 and $135 US, with models from Asus, Asrock, Gigabyte, and MSI. Please note that I'll automatically be skipping over any B550 board without a VRM heatsink. Those boards really should only be used with 65 watt TDP parts, and if you can help it, we strongly recommend you avoid any such board at all costs. So on hand for testing, we have the following, and I'll start with the cheapest board, and then I'll work my way up. We have the Gigabyte B550M DS3H at $95, the Asrock B550M Pro 4 at $115, the Gigabyte B550M Aorus Elite at $110, the MSI B550M Pro-VDH Wi-Fi at $125, the MSI B550M Bazooka and Gigabyte B550M Aorus Pro at $130, and finally the Asus Prime B550M-A at $135. The Prime is the most expensive motherboard here, so let's take a closer look. On the I/O panel, there's 6 USB 3.2 ports, 2 are Gen 2 and 4 are Gen 1 ports. The audio is very basic, here you're just getting an ALC 887 codec, and for the wide networking, the Realtek RTL 8111H gigabit controller. It also features 4 SATA 6 gigabits per second ports, 2 M.2 ports that support both NVMe and SATA SSDs, a front USB 3.2 header, and a single PCIe x16 slot. As for the VRM, we've got a pretty basic looking 4-phase V-core here, using Vishay SIRA 14DP FETs on the high side, with a pair of Vishay SIRA 12 FETs on the low side, feeding into a single inductor. Cooling these components is a rather small heatsink with a few fins cut into it, so it will be interesting to see how this board handles the Ryzen 9 parts. Then from MSI we have 2 boards, the cheapest of which is the MSI B550M Pro-VDH Wi-Fi, which as the name suggests includes Wi-Fi, though it's not Wi-Fi 6, but rather Intel AC3168. But it's still $5 cheaper than the Prime B550MA without any Wi-Fi. MSI is also offering half a dozen USB ports on the I/O panel, though the USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports are accessible via an onboard header, leaving the I/O panel with 4 Gen 1 ports and 2 USB 2.0 ports. The board also includes the same basic Realtek audio and gigabit LAN. There's 4 SATA ports, a single PCIe x16 slot, and 2 M.2 slots, so very similar to the more expensive Asus model. But where the B550M Pro-VDH Wi-Fi shines is in its VRM configuration. Here you're still getting a 4-phase V-core, but on the high side there's 2 onsemi 4C029 FETs, and on the low side 2 onsemi 4C024N FETs. So this board should perform better than the Asus model. The heatsink is also a lot better and should work well in our test system. Has to be said, the Pro-VDH Wi-Fi is a very basic looking motherboard, so if you're after something a little more flashy, a bit more gamerish if you will, then the B550M Bazooka for $5 more will no doubt appeal to you. The Bazooka drops the Wi-Fi support along with the VGA port on the I/O panel, and as far as I can tell it doesn't really pick up any new features to replace them, so it's basically just a flashier version of the Pro-VDH without a few of the bells and whistles. The only advantage the Bazooka might have is the larger heatsink, which might help with thermals, though the fin design of the Pro-VDH does work very well, at least it has in our previous tests. And under the heatsink you'll find the exact same VRM components, so not much more to say here really. Next up we have the Gigabyte B550M DS3H, and this is one of the cheapest B550 boards you'll find with an actual heatsink over the V-core portion of the VRM. At $95 US, it is very cheap for a B550 board, so unsurprisingly it packs basic audio and wide networking from Realtek with no form of wireless networking. The I/O panel features 4 USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports with a pair of USB 2.0 ports, so it is quite well stocked in that regard, though there is no USB 3.2 Gen 2 support anywhere on the board. There are, however, 2 M.2 slots and 4 SATA 6 gigabits per second ports, so overall quite a well-equipped board given the price. As for the VRM, the V-core features 5 phases, each with an onsemi 4C10N FET on the high side, and then 2 onsemi 4C06 FETs on the low side, and each phase feeds into a single inductor. This is a similar configuration to the Asus Prime B550M-A, but I believe Gigabyte's used higher quality components. Their heatsink is very basic, so they will be banking on more efficient MOSFETs to beat the Prime. The Gigabyte B550M Aorus Elite is basically a fancier version of the DS3H, a bit like what the MSI Bazooka is to the Pro-VDH Wi-Fi. The Aorus Elite has the exact same I/O configuration as the DS3H, but as a bonus it comes with an I/O shield pre-installed. The exact same audio and networking hardware has also been used, and we're looking at the exact same board layout as well. So 2 PCIe x 16 slots, 4 SATA 6 gigabits per second ports, 2 M.2 slots, and a USB 3.1 Gen 1 front panel header. The boards also share the exact same VRM design, the only difference being the heatsink used. The Aorus Elite gets a much bigger heatsink that extends over the plastic I/O cover, so it should capture a lot more airflow and therefore enable lower VRM temps. All that said, you are paying $15 more for a bigger heatsink, a pre-installed I/O shield, and just a more aggressive looking board in general. For the next step up in terms of features and quality, Gigabyte offers the B550M Aorus Pro for a $20 premium over the Elite. It's a reasonably significant upgrade as well. The audio codec has been upgraded from the ALC887 to the ALC1220VB codec with 7.1 channel support, and you will be able to hear the difference. The board still uses a Realtek Gigabit LAN chip, but the I/O panel has been upgraded quite significantly. You're now getting 4 USB 2.0 ports, 4 USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports, and 2 USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports, one of which is a Type-C. The Q flash button has also been moved to the I/O panel for easier access. The other big changes have been made to the VRM. The Aorus Pro packs a 10-phase V-Core VRM, as it takes 5 signals from the PWM controller and doubles them using ISL6617A phase doublers. Each phase features an on-semi 4C10N FET on the high side, with an on-semi 4C06 FET on the low side. This is a significant upgrade from the Aorus Elite, and on top of that, Gigabyte's thrown in some pretty big heat sinks as well. And finally, we have the Asrock B550M Pro 4, which shares its VRM with the standard ATX version of the Pro 4, as well as the cheaper Asrock B550 Phantom Gaming 4. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to purchase the Phantom Gaming 4 in time for this content, and since Asrock has blacklisted us, we aren't able to get it directly from the manufacturer. The Phantom 4 will perform a little bit worse than the Pro 4 due to the smaller heatsink, but you should be able to use the Pro 4 results as a bit of a rough guide. As one of the cheapest boards featured in this roundup, the Pro 4 is surprisingly well stocked. Asrock's gone with the Realtek ALC1200 audio codec, which is nice, and they're also using Realtek for the wide gigabit LAN. Around on the I/O panel, you also get USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C, along with a Type-A Gen 2 port as well. There's another 4 USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports and then 2 USB 2.0 ports, and on board there are 2 M.2 slots, 6 SATA 6 gigabits per second ports, and 2 PCIe x 16 slots. Then topping all that off, Asrock's gone with a 6-phase V-Core VRM using UPI's UP9505P controller. From it, 3 signals are fed into 3 UP1916S phase doublers, with each phase featuring Sinopower SM4337 FETs on the high side and Sinopower SM336 FETs on the low side. This is basically the same VRM configuration found on the Asrock X570 Pro 4, minus 2 phases, so it should work pretty well. Asrock's also slapped on a massive heatsink for good measure, and I have to say this is one of the better looking budget B550 boards, so I'm keen to see how it performs. But before we get to the graphs, let's talk about the test conditions. For this testing and any future AM4 VRM thermal testing, I've built a dedicated system with the help of Corsair, who sent over their Obsidian Series 500D mid-tower case, RM850X power supply, iQOO H150i RGB Pro XT all-in-one liquid cooler, and 32GB of their Vengeance RGB Pro DDR4 3200 memory. The Obsidian 500D has been configured with a single rear 120mm exhaust fan and then 2 top-mounted 140mm exhaust fans. Then in the front of the case we have the H150i 360mm radiator with 3 120mm intake fans. This is a pretty standard configuration, at least for a higher end system. The airflow is good, and in a 21-degree room I'd say this is an optimal setup. For recording temperatures, I'm using a digital thermometer with K-type thermocouples, and I'll be reporting the peak rear PCB temperature. Finally, I'm not reporting delta T over ambient, instead I maintain a room temperature of 21 degrees, and to ensure a consistent ambient temperature, a thermocouple is positioned next to the test system. Now for this testing, we have 4 configurations using 3 different Ryzen processors. The base configuration, which every board should pass with ease, sees us use the Ryzen 7 3700X. It's a low powered part that only draws about 85 to 90 watts in our blender stress test. Then we have the Ryzen 9 3900X, which will be tested completely stock, no overclocking for that part, and no changes made to the BIOS other than loading XMP. And I should note that all motherboards have been tested with the latest available BIOS at the time of testing. The 3900X configuration pushes CPU load up to 140 watts in our test. Then we have the Ryzen 9 3950X, which has been tested twice, once stock and then once with a 4.3 GHz overclock using 1.375 volts. The stock configuration again only pushes CPU usage to around 140 watts, but it does so at a lower stock voltage. So we are pulling slightly more amperage, which will put a little bit more load on the motherboard's VRM. Finally, the 4.3 GHz configuration pushes CPU power consumption right up to 200 watts, so this is our most extreme test. So to summarize, all testing has been conducted in a well-ventilated case in a 21-degree room, so I consider these conditions to be best case. Okay, so starting with the 3700X results, we see that all boards pass this test, though some do much more easily than others. The MSI B550M Bazooka, for example, is the best performer here, peaking at just 49 degrees, and for those wondering, it does copy its VRM design from the B450 Tomahawk, and that means so does the B550M Pro-VDH Wi-Fi. Though I should note that the cheaper Pro-VDH features a lower profile heatsink which doesn't capture airflow from the top mounted case fans as well as the heatsink on the Bazooka, hence the slight increase in operating temperature. The Asrock B550M Pro 4 also performs well here and is comparable to the MSI boards. The Gigabyte B550 boards are less impressive, peaking at almost 60 degrees, and that doesn't make them too much better than the old B350 Tomahawk. So that's disappointing and a little concerning. That said, by far the most concerning result can be seen when looking at the Asus Prime B550M-A. Quite shockingly, this board peaked at 70 degrees, which, granted, is a very safe operating temperature, but certainly not a good result given we're only using the 3700X. I can't imagine this board's going to tackle the Ryzen 9 parts very well. And speaking of which, let's move on to see how the 3900X influences VRM temperatures. Now, this is very interesting and perhaps a little bit puzzling, though I think I can explain what we're seeing here. The MSI B550M Bazooka, which shares the same VRM design as the B450 Tomahawk and B550M Pro-VDH Wi-Fi, is seen running up to 11 degrees cooler, which doesn't seem possible. However, MSI's onboard VRM sensor reported the same temperature as my K-type thermocouples, and this was the case for all three boards: the B550M Bazooka, B450 Tomahawk, and B550M Pro-VDH Wi-Fi. I also didn't change the position of the K-type probes between CPU changes. They were all fitted to the identified hotspots and kept in place for the duration of the testing, and for those wondering, I use 8 individual probes. I believe the advantage the Bazooka has over the Pro-VDH is the bigger heatsink, and the key attribute here is the height. The heatsink on the Pro-VDH stands just 22mm tall, whereas the Bazooka heatsink is 38mm tall, and that 73% increase in height makes a massive difference when it comes to capturing airflow in our test system. It also weighs 71% more at 178 grams opposed to 104 grams, and that means it takes a bit longer to heat soak. Then when compared to the B450 Tomahawk, which also uses a large VRM heatsink, I believe the advantage the Bazooka has is a 2-ounce thickened copper PCB and more efficient thermal pads that improve the effectiveness of the heatsink. On top of that, the Bazooka uses higher quality inductors, which are also cooled via the heatsink, and that should see them dump less heat into the PCB. Another advantage appears to be voltage tuning. On average, the Bazooka ran the Ryzen 9 processor at slightly lower voltages when compared to the Tomahawk, though we are using onboard reporting, which isn't always known to be super accurate. Anyway, the end result being amazing thermals for the Bazooka, setting the benchmark at just 60 degrees. The Pro-VDH Wi-Fi was the next best B550 board at around 71 degrees, followed by the Gigabyte B550M Aorus Pro at 74 degrees, and the Asrock B550M Pro 4 at 76 degrees, all of which are excellent results. The Aorus Elite jumped up to 82 degrees, which is still quite a good result, though you won't really want to do any serious Ryzen 9 overclocking on this board. Gigabyte's B550M DS3H is another board you'll want to keep stock for use with a Ryzen 9 processor, as it hit 89 degrees, which is a pass, but not a great result overall, though it was a darn sight better than the Asus Prime B550M-A, which hit 103 degrees, the same temperature reached by the old and not particularly good B350 Tomahawk. So that's a disappointing result for the Asus board, especially given it is the most expensive board here. That being the case, I'd avoid it entirely for anyone wanting to run a Ryzen 9 processor for any serious productivity tasks. Now, slightly increasing the VRM load with the 3950X saw the Bazooka temperature rise by 8 degrees and the Pro-VDH by 5 degrees, and I suspect we are starting to load up the larger heatsink a bit more in this test. Still, the Bazooka was by far the best board, and sub 70 degree temps here is a stellar result. The Pro-VDH also does quite well, hitting 76 degrees, and the Asrock B550M Pro 4 peaked at 81 degrees, which is certainly starting to get quite hot, but it's also a safe, sustained operating temperature. We also see that the Gigabyte B550M Aorus Pro crept closer to 90 degrees with a peak operating temperature of 86 degrees, while the Elite was a few degrees hotter at 88 degrees. Then we have the Gigabyte B550M DS3H pushing up to 96 degrees, and while the board should survive okay at these temperatures, it's not exactly ideal. And less than ideal is the Asus Prime B550M-A at 109 degrees. In my opinion, that's too hot, and I wouldn't want to run this board for core-heavy workloads with a Ryzen 9 processor. It's unlikely anyone's going to buy this budget Asus B550 board today for use with a Ryzen 9 processor, but it is very possible that they'd upgrade to one in the future. Think second-hand deals in a few years' time, for example. So in that sense, it's really just not a good value motherboard, even if it was priced at, say, $110 US, for example. Now, say in a few years' time you did buy a second-hand 3950X and you were like, you know what, this thing isn't fast enough, I really do need to overclock it. How hot will these boards run then? With the 3950X running all 16 cores at 4.3 GHz using 1.375 volts, the package power pushes up to 200 watts, and that's a serious load for these budget B550 boards. Please note all boards were tested with the maximum LLC, and power consumption was monitored throughout the test. The only B550 board here to keep the peak VRM temperature below 100 degrees was the MSI B550M Bazooka, peaking at 94 degrees, which relative to the other B550 boards is a great result. That said, if you're going to overclock the 3950X on this board, I'd ensure direct airflow over the VRM heatsink. The Pro-VDH ran 10 degrees hotter, hitting 104 degrees, while the Asrock B550M Pro 4 peaked at 105 degrees, so I'd avoid overclocking any Ryzen 9 processors on those motherboards. And of course, the same is obviously true for the much hotter running Gigabyte B550 boards, though they did pass this test, avoiding any kind of CPU throttling or crashes. Unfortunately, the Asus Prime B550M-A didn't throttle the CPU, it just crashed out a few minutes into the stress test and I was unable to stabilize the board for this overclock. Well, that brings us to the end of our budget B550 VRM thermal testing. Now it's time to discuss the results. And normally for these entry-level motherboard tests, we end up with at least one board that is just a complete and utter disaster. Asrock, for example, they recently claimed that honor with their terrible Z490 boards, and then before that it was MSI's turn with their X570 boards, which they did eventually refresh. This time around though, I am happy to report that there's no board that was a complete bleep show. They all worked right up to the stock Ryzen 9 3950X. That said, some boards were clearly much better than others, and the biggest disappointment here was the most expensive board, the Asus Prime B550M-A. After seeing this board peak at 70 degrees with the Ryzen 7 3700X, I knew it wasn't going to fare too well with the Ryzen 9 parts. And I was right, peaking at just over 100 degrees with the 3900X. The board did manage to pass the 3900X test, and it also did the same with the 3950X, at least stock. But the results were pretty horrible, really, pretty awful, and frankly, I'd avoid this board at all costs. There are much better options at lower price points. For those of you who are just gaming, the board will work just fine, at least in today's games, and it'll handle core-heavy workloads with any and all 65-watt TDP processors with relative ease. Still, as I said, it's just not a good value board, and even the non-Wi-Fi version should be avoided at $135 US. At under $100, it might be worth considering. Speaking of which, the cheapest board featured in this roundup, the Gigabyte B550M DS3H, did quite well given it cost just $95 US. It's by no means a great board, but it did handle the 3900X quite well, and given the price it is hard to knock the results. I wouldn't recommend it for anyone running in high ambient environments, but for cooler rooms like ours it will work, even with the stock 3950X. For $20 more, the Asrock B550M Pro 4 drops the VRM temps with the 3900X down from 89 degrees to a more manageable 76 degrees, and you also get a few nice upgrades such as USB 3.2 Gen 2 with the Type-C connector on the I/O panel, better quality audio, and a few extra SATA ports. So the B550M Pro 4 is certainly a nice quality board, worth your consideration. I'm not quite as impressed with the Gigabyte B550M Aorus Elite and Aorus Pro. They're decent boards, but $110 US, the Aorus Elite is outclassed by the Asrock B550M Pro 4, while the Aorus Pro wasn't strong enough against the slightly cheaper MSI B550M Pro-VDH Wi-Fi, while the Bazooka just blew it out of the water. And that brings us to the MSI B550M Pro-VDH Wi-Fi and Bazooka. For those of you who intend on upgrading to a Ryzen 9 processor in the future, I feel the Bazooka is the board to get. The VRM temperatures were amazing, and even in a warmer environment, this board will have no issue handling the 3950X for core-heavy workloads. At the current $130 US asking price, it's a great value board and a nice step up from the B450 Tomahawk. The B550M Pro-VDH Wi-Fi is also a great value board and is actually better in terms of features, so if you don't require best-in-class VRM thermals, this is actually the board to get. In my opinion, the MSI B550M Pro-VDH Wi-Fi is the best value motherboard of this bunch, followed by the Asrock B550M Pro 4. However, if you've set your sights on overclocking, particularly if it's a Ryzen 9 processor, then I'd get the MSI B550M Bazooka. The Gigabyte boards are also decent, but they're generally outclassed by the MSI and Asrock models that we just mentioned, while the Asus Prime B550M-A simply can't compete at any level. And for those of you wondering, MSI and Gigabyte have been very helpful by submitting their entire range of B550 motherboards for our testing, while Asus has provided most of their B550 range with the exception of the sub $150 US boards, so that meant we did have to buy the Prime B550M-A Wi-Fi. Unfortunately, the people over at Asrock have decided to blacklist Hardware Unboxed after the Z490 content, and they've also done the same to Gamers Nexus. So that's forced us to buy any of their B550 boards that we want to use for testing. But thanks to our wonderful Patreon members, we don't need to rely on manufacturer support, so there's no hiding a bad board from us. Thankfully though, it would seem Asrock's engineers look to have done a good job with their B550 motherboards, at least the Pro 4, we'll look at more soon, and that does make the decision from the marketing department to ignore us all the more disappointing. This of course won't influence our opinion of Asrock's products, but it is disappointing to see our 10+ year relationship with the company end in this way. And that is going to do it for this first round of B550 VRM thermal testing. I'm hoping to have part 2 on the channel next week, and I plan to look at 8 more boards priced between $140 and $170 US. Now, if you liked this video, well, you can do that. You can also subscribe, and if you'd like to join us over on Patreon, where you get the opportunity to support our work and let us buy motherboards that don't get sent to us, but you also get some pretty cool perks as well. We have an exclusive Discord chat for Patreon members only. You can talk about VRM testing if you like. You can talk about Tim's monitor reviews, tech in general, anything really. Check it out if you're interested. We have the Patreon Q&A stuff. We have a Patreon exclusive live stream each month, so that's worth checking out. Some interesting stuff is discussed there usually. But anyway, if you're interested, link is in the video description. But that is going to do it for this one. Thank you very much for watching. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.